engaged in colonialism, which was universally bad.
Numerous societies throughout history have engaged in conquest and colonialization of other lands. Examples include the colonies of ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, Han Chinese imperialism, the Muslim invasions of North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula and Indian subcontinent, and the colonies of the Polynesians and Torres Strait Islanders. Yet when the word colonialism is used in academia, the media, government or other major institutions, it is presented as abnormal and peculiarly European, especially when carried out by the British. Naturally, the experience of being conquered or colonized has invidious aspects. At the same time, it is often viewed by the colonizers as enterprising and even heroic. No colonialism has been more remarkable in its achievement than small European countries establishing working societies in lands oceans away. Britain's establishment of thriving colonies in North America and Australasia was an achievement of historic importance. Furthermore, Western, especially Anglo nations bestowed significant benefits on the peoples they colonized. These included systems of constitutional governance, principles such as free speech and the rule of law, English common law, the ending of practices such as slavery, and suttee, the burning of widows in pre-colonial India on the funeral pyres of their husbands, the material and cultural wealth of industry and science, and the Western canon of art, literature, music, and architecture. Despite these redeeming features, Western colonialism is falsely portrayed as failing to provide any benefit at all to those who experienced it. In contrast, non-Western colonizers such as the Ottomans, Moors, or Chinese are ignored or even given mostly favorable coverage for their artistic, literary, musical, and architectural contributions. A double standard is evident in which replacement-level immigration to Western societies is praised for benefiting the migrants, but historical Western colonialism is condemned without reference to its manifold benefits to the immigrants from Europe. This one-sided approach to colonialism as European bad but all others good is another case of ingrained and institutionalized Anglophobia. Anti-colonial sentiment is now being expressed in cancel culture. In Australia and overseas, statues commemorating white explorers and political and military leaders have been desecrated or torn down. Attempts are being made to ethnically cleanse whites from the language by changing the names of inventions and scientific discoveries if the inventor or discoverer was white or guilty of a colonial-type sentiment. Thus, efforts are underway to rename Newton's laws of motion the three fundamental laws of physics, in order to decenter whiteness and decolonize the curriculum. This push by hostile elites to delegitimize colonialism, or rather the interests of the descendants of colonists, coincided with some Anglos seeking to remove restrictions on non-white immigration. During the 1950s and 1960s, rejection of colonialism appears to have been an important rationale. An early example was the Australian poet Alec Derwin-Hope, 1907 to 2000, who was educated at Sydney and Oxford universities. In 1939, Hope published a poem titled Australia. Though the poem contains lines of affection for his country, Hope also expressed anxiety about national inferiority.
Without songs, architecture, history, and her 5 cities, like 5 teeming sores, each drains her. A vast parasite robber state, where second-hand Europeans pullulate timidly on the edge of alien shores.
There were several glaring errors in Hope's critique, the least important of which was that by 1939 Australia had 6, not 5, capital cities. These included one sitting astride the river that shares Hope's middle name. Already, a century earlier, indeed from 1788, Australia shared the ancient history and culture of its mother country. Another error of the poem is to imply that Anglo-Australia was somehow parasitic, when in fact, the farms and roads and cities were built by the sweat of settlers, many of them ex-convicts. What does it mean to be second-hand Europeans? Used? That is meaningless, except for its pejorative connotations. The same applied to pullulate, which means to swarm. As for timidly on the edge, by 1939 Australia was one of the wealthiest and most dynamic economies, due not only to its industrialism and integration in the British global trading system, but to the early pioneering farmers and graziers who had ventured inland and made a harsh continent yield riches. A less poetic but more serious Anglophobic movement only began in the 1950s and 1960s when anti-colonialism became fashionable among intellectuals. In the vanguard was the Immigration Reform Group, or IRG, established by leftist Anglo academics in the late 1950s. In 1975, Kenneth Rivet, a lecturer in economics at the University of New South Wales and leading member of the group, named the IRG group members as himself, Christine Inglis, a lecturer in education at the University of Sydney, Fiona Mackey, a tutor in sociology at La Trobe University, Audrey Renison, a lecturer in social work at the University of New South Wales, Alan Ward, a lecturer in history at La Trobe University, and 5 individuals whose occupations were not listed. The group contained what had become a British intellectual tradition of self-criticism, an expression of European tendency towards individualism and muted tribalism. An early pamphlet from the Immigration Reform Group was published in 1960, Control or Colour Bar. Let us be clear what the group's aims were. They wanted to remove the restrictive immigration policy that had shaped the nation into a cohesive, largely homogenous one. The 1960 version of the Liberal Immigration Platform, which resembled Labor's, had as its 129th policy, quote, preservation of our national heritage by special encouragement and assistance to persons of British stock desiring to settle in Australia, unquote. The pamphlet advanced 2 reasons why Australia should abandon its traditional immigration policy. Firstly, it claimed that ethnically selective immigration has bad effects within Australia. It claimed that the policy poisoned race relations and depressed Australia's culture below what it could gain by a small intake of Asians. The Reform Group pamphlet stated, quote, we need Asian immigrants to enrich our culture, unquote. It asserted that an Asian intake would increase Australia's understanding of neighbouring countries, that it would prepare us to participate in racially diverse international forums, and finally, and rather patronisingly, it claimed that breaking down Australia's Anglo-homogeneity would make it more effective at helping Asian countries. The Immigration Reform Group's second reason for urging Asian immigration was to rescue Australia from its racist image overseas. It claimed that the pro-white policy had, quote, a disastrous impact on non-European opinion, unquote, because non-whites found the policy deeply offensive. Significantly, the authors did not urge Asian and African countries to open their borders to whites in order to enrich their cultures and learn how to handle diversity. Perhaps they did not do so because such a message would have sounded like neo-colonialism and racial chauvinism. The double standard was clearly Anglophobic. To universalize this proposition is to falsify it. To have any moral force, it must imply that people around the world find it deeply offensive when other countries do not accept immigrants from their own nations, even when those nations themselves discriminate in selecting immigrants. It is a fact that Japan fiercely criticized Australia's exclusion of Asians despite not accepting immigrants itself, and later accepting mainly ethnic Japanese. The same applies to India. ethnically selective immigration has always been the norm. The Immigration Reform Group never asked the obvious question: should white Australians be offended by Asian countries such as Japan and India preferring immigrants of their own ethnicity? Neither did the group answer that question in the affirmative by protesting anti-white immigration policies in Asian countries. Repeatedly, Control or Colour Bar committed howlers of both commission and omission, while steadfastly exuding confidence. This was as much a cynical ideological tract as it was a work of reason. The crude Anglophobia of the pamphlet is indicated by another bold assertion, quote, "It is a truism that humanity may wipe itself out unless the white race establishes a new relationship with the others," unquote. This was in 1960 when the nuclear standoff alluded to was between two predominantly white populations, the United States and the Soviet Union. The two other nuclear powers at the time were Britain and France. The first non-white power to acquire nuclear weapons was China in 1964. Its ability to wipe out humanity has been slow to arrive. So clearly the implication was that whites would destroy the world. As whites monopolized nuclear weapons in 1960, the pamphlet was implying that they were likely to attack non-white countries with nuclear weapons, something that had not happened since the Second World War, when the United States used 2 fission bombs to end the war begun by racially supremacist Imperial Japan. The imputation was Anglophobia. Cheap scare tactics, exaggerations, and Anglophobic prejudice occurred throughout the pamphlet. The Immigration Reform Group consisted largely of Anglo-utopians who sought to strip Australia of the normal immigration protections. They also criticised America's protective immigration laws. The group was an early sign of cultural elites falling into confusion and effective hostility towards their own people. Their inclinations included intolerance of the Anglo tradition of free speech, a tendency that would emerge with full force in the 1970s and 1980s, as discussed later in Section 5A. This was a mentality that shut down public debate on immigration and identity and led to the reckless policy of opening Australia's doors to global diversity. Other policies of the Immigration Reform Group were unfriendly to Anglos. They behaved as though whites had no group interests, that it was wrong to seek to remain the majority, and that the disasters of ethno-religious diversity were not manifest around the world. More sinister was their decision to adopt a deceptive Fabian method to get around public opposition to Asian immigration. This ruthless strategy was evident in their escalating demands and was made explicit by Arthur Stein, an American member. In a 1961 article titled "The Thin Edge of the Wedge," Stein explained that the Immigration Reform Group should begin by calling for small intakes of Asians, then call for more and more. This method demonstrated zero respect for the democratic wishes of the majority Anglo population. The Immigration Reform Group deserves criticism for denying or ignoring Anglo-ethnic interests. Their scholarship was faulty. For example, they ignored the original rationale of restrictive immigration, formulated by philosopher John Stuart Mill and taken up and adapted to Australia by Sir Henry Parkes, a longtime Premier of New South Wales and the father of Federation. Immigration Reform Group members were academics in the soft social sciences and humanities, historians, sociologists, educationalists, and other academics who should have known the intellectual basis of the White Australia policy. As informed liberals, they should have known that by the mid-19th century, John Stuart Mill recognised ethnic interests and the conflict resulting from ethnic diversity. Sir Henry Parkes, the progressive Premier of New South Wales, accepted this argument and initiated the movement to federalise the colonies, an initiative that created the Australian Commonwealth. Yes, many wage earners were motivated to support the policy, not only for ethnic or cultural reasons, but as a means to maintain decent wages and working conditions. But identity was also a powerful factor. as it has been for ethnic and nationalist movements around the world. By the 1950s, the soft social sciences in the US had been captured by the cosmopolitan new social sciences. This has been documented by Eric Kaufman in his book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. It was not surprising, therefore, that the immigration reform group's position on immigration became dominant in the universities. At no point did they subsequently acknowledge the criminal involvement in the liberalisation of Australian immigration or the introduction of multiculturalism, as will be seen later on in Section C, which covers violence. The popular historian Donald Horne, who lived from 1921 to 2005, was influenced by the immigration reform group. Statements in his best-known book, The Lucky Country, published in 1964, align with the group's reasoning and assumptions. Horne came to echo Alec Hope's contempt for Anglo-Australia and his anxiety about national inferiority. Horne's book is valuable for its impressions of the immigration reform movement of the late 1950s and early 1960s, which successfully agitated for the ending of the White Australia policy. In particular, he noted the immigration reform group and its pamphlet, Control or Colour Bar. He reported that the calls for reform, that is to say, in favour of Asian immigration, were coming from the young, university-educated generation in both the Liberal and Labor parties. He stated that a cause for this change of view largely originated in elite opinion-forming quarters. Indeed, public support for white immigration remained strong. Arthur Stein of the Immigration Reform Group complained in 1961 that only one newspaper, the Melbourne Herald, precursor to the Herald Sun, editorialised against the White Australia policy. In a footnote, Horne stated that he had since changed his view in one respect, quote, "I no longer agree that this policy does not damage us in Asian countries, and I now think that a quota system or some other restricted but public arrangement would be accepted as an improvement," unquote. In subsequent pages, he accepted other views from the immigration reform group. He thought that Filipinos and rich Chinese from Hong Kong would pose no risks of tension or destruction of ways of life to Australia. He asserted that, quote, "an increased intake of Asian elites would certainly enrich Australian life," unquote. Most relevant to the present analysis, Horne expressed anti-English sentiment. He suggested that Asian elites would offset the disproportionate English role in the universities. In a later book, The Next Australia, Horne continued his Anglophobia, criticising Australians' British identity and loyalty as a form of, quote, "master racism," unquote. Horne wanted to cut off Australia's national identity from its history. In The Lucky Country, Horne asserted that Australia could only be effective in Asian diplomacy if it reduced Asian fears by making visible changes to its immigration policy. That is to say, by increasing the rate of Asian entry, and asserted the defeatist version of the, quote, "yellow peril," a fear subsequently adopted by Malcolm Fraser. This maintained that Australia has no choice but to allow Asian immigration, that it should, in effect, accept a subordinate status in relation to countries in the region, a status tolerated by no non-Western country. Horne wrote, quote, "It is a task that will be undertaken either by Australians or by someone else," unquote. This selectively pessimistic prognosis for Australian self-determination led Horne to a radical, one might say, defeatist conclusion that is now mainstream in the multicultural establishment. He wrote, quote, "My own view is that the future holds dramatic possibilities for Australia, which may necessarily include racial change, that this is Australia's destiny," unquote. We've already indicated that Horne's case is flawed. He displayed inconsistency. Consider his anti-English sentiment that Australia imports too many English university teachers. Horne thought this to be a problem because it contributed to the, quote, "serious alienation of Australian intellectuals from their own people," unquote. What was his solution? Quote, "We may need some Japanese, Indians, and Chinese to help break up the English influence," unquote. The unstated assumption is that students would be less alienated from Asian professors than from English ones. A strange logic given that most Australians in 1964 were of British ancestry. Why was Horne so prejudiced against the English?
This video has been proudly produced by the British Australian community.